In the cold winter of 1942, as the Allies faced the full force of the German Wehrmacht pushing through Europe, a quiet figure, an ordinary farmer from the English countryside, would change the course of history, not with a rifle or a tank, but with the tools of his trade. It wasn't strategy or tactics that gave him the upper hand. It was sheer ingenuity. Imagine taking the parts of an old tractor, cobbling them together with a few scraps, and building a makeshift weapon capable of taking down the might of a Nazi panzer division. He never saw himself as a hero, just a man doing what needed to be done to protect his country. Little did he know, his invention would be used on battlefields across Europe, helping to turn the tide of the war. This is the story of a farmer who became an unlikely war hero, without ever firing a shot himself. In the autumn of 1942, England was still reeling from the chaos of the Blitz, and yet there was a quiet strength in the land, a strength that came not from the weapons in the hands of soldiers, but from the ingenuity of ordinary men and women. The roar of the Luftwaffe was fading, but the shadow of the Wehrmacht loomed ever closer. The world felt it. The weight of it. The cold dread of the Blitzkrieg still pressed down on the shoulders of every Briton. But in a small village, just outside of London, a farmer named John McAllister, who had never fired a gun in his life, found a way to fight back, though he didn't yet know it. McAllister was a quiet man, his life woven with the rhythm of the land, of plowing fields and mending fences. He lived in a cottage that smelled of earth and hay, and each morning, the sound of his boots crunching through the frost was like a clock ticking in the stillness of the countryside. He wasn't a military man. He hadn't been trained to fight, to strategize, to outmaneuver the enemy. But there was something in the air, something that made him feel as though the world was changing, and he had a part to play, though he didn't know how. It started with a conversation on a particularly crisp morning. McAllister was at the village pub, the fire crackling in the hearth, when the topic of war came up. As it did most nights, the men around the table spoke of the German advance, of how the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, their tanks rolling across Europe like a storm. There was nothing in the world that could stand against them, they said. Nothing, except for the Allied forces, who seemed always to be one step behind. But McAllister, with his eyes full of the quiet wisdom of a man who lived close to the earth, said, "If we can't beat them in their tanks, then maybe we can do something with our own hands." The men laughed at first. They thought it was just another remark from a farmer, someone who had no idea of the scale of the war they were discussing. But McAllister wasn't joking. He had something in mind. He went home that night, his mind racing, and stood in his workshop, looking at the old tractor parked near the barn. The tractor had served him well for years, its rusty wheels turning over the fields every season, its engine roaring to life every morning like a faithful dog. But tonight, it was something more. It was the beginning of an idea that would save countless lives. The next few days were filled with strange sounds, metal clanging, sparks flying, and the smell of burning fuel. McAllister worked tirelessly, long hours spent in his workshop, surrounded by the hum of tools and the quiet crackle of the fire. He wasn't sure what he was doing exactly, but he knew he had to try. If the Germans had their panzer tanks, then maybe he could build something to fight them, a weapon that could stop the machines of war, even if it was just for a few moments. What he created Well, it wasn't much to look at, to be honest. It was, in his eyes, a crude attempt at something far greater. He took parts of his old tractor, some scrap metal from the barn, and welded them together, creating a simple, makeshift anti-tank device. It wasn't much, a few metal rods and chains, but it could be placed in front of an advancing tank, and the hope was that it would stop them, just enough to delay their march. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing at first. How could he? A farmer building a weapon in his barn. It seemed ridiculous. But when he finished, he stepped back and looked at his creation. The thing that was, in many ways, born of desperation and necessity. He smiled, though the smile was thin, uncertain. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the weapon that would win the war. But in that moment, it was something, at least. And so, on the night of November 4th, 1942, with no one else around, he decided to test it. He placed the device in the path of a German supply convoy that was rumored to be passing near his farm. The convoy was moving in the dead of night, unaware that McAllister's invention was waiting for them. It wasn't a tank, not in the traditional sense, just a contraption of metal and desperation. He could hear the rumbling of the engines growing closer as the convoy made its way down the country road. His heart raced in his chest, a thundering beat that drowned out all the other sounds around him. As the convoy came into view, McAllister felt a cold sweat on his brow. He wasn't sure if the device would work. In fact, he was almost certain it wouldn't. But as the first tank rolled over the makeshift device, there was a sudden, sharp crack, then another, and the tank ground to a halt. The chain and metal rods had caught in the treads, jamming them. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt like something far bigger. The next day, McAllister stood in the quiet of the fields, looking at the device. It wasn't just the Germans who had underestimated him. It was the world. A simple farmer with nothing but an idea and the tools at his disposal had just found a way to stop the might of the German Wehrmacht, if only for a brief moment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, word of McAllister's invention began to spread. At first, the army dismissed it as a farmer's fantasy, but as the Allies' need for unconventional weapons grew, they took a closer look. The design, crude as it was, showed potential. It wasn't a tank killer in the traditional sense, but it could delay the advance of German tanks long enough to allow for a counterattack, to give the Allied forces a chance to regroup and strike back. In the coming months, McAllister's device would be refined, improved, and adapted. His creation, born of desperation and ingenuity, would help change the course of the war. But McAllister never saw himself as a hero. He was just a farmer, doing what he could in a world turned upside down by war. And when it was over, and the dust settled, he returned to his farm, to the quiet of the fields and the hum of his old tractor. The war was over, but the memory of what he had done, that would stay with him forever. You could almost hear the wind rustling through the trees, the sound of a country untouched by the battles that had raged beyond its borders. And you could feel, in that moment, how something small, something simple, could change everything. As the war stretched on, the days seemed to blur together, like a fog over the fields that McAllister had known his entire life. His simple farm, where he once plowed the land with steady hands, had become something else, something he never imagined it would be. It had become the site of an idea that, though born out of desperation, had given hope to men in uniform. But the man himself? He was still just John McAllister, the farmer who had simply done what he felt was needed. Yet the weight of what he had done began to settle in, bit by bit. After that first test of his invention, how it had halted a German tank, just for a moment, long enough for the convoy to escape, things changed. At first, it was just whispers. Soldiers in the local garrison, the engineers in town, they heard about it, and they came to see for themselves. The device had been crude, certainly. Nothing like the high-tech weaponry you'd see in the grand war machine. But the results were undeniable. McAllister watched from his farm as one by one, soldiers and officers, first British, then American, arrived at his door. He was a man who had never thought of himself as a soldier. He had never worn a uniform, never walked a line in the sand of battle. Yet here they were, standing on his doorstep, asking him about his invention. It was hard to believe at first. McAllister had spent years working the land, and here he was, being asked to teach military men about warfare. But there was no denying it now. His creation had caught the eye of the military, and soon that eye was focused on him. The first of many Army officials arrived in early December 1942, only weeks after. McAllister had made his first attempt with the device. They were cautious at first, skeptical. How could something as simple as a farmer's contraption make a difference against the mighty Wehrmacht? But McAllister simply shrugged. He was no expert on tanks. He wasn't even sure the thing would work. He had built it out of necessity, out of the desperation of a country that was fighting for survival. And perhaps that, more than anything else, was what gave the device its power, its raw, unpolished potential. The military began to test McAllister's tank killer with more serious intent. The first tests were small, quiet, like secretive whispers in the night. The device was tested against abandoned vehicles, mock German tanks parked in a field far away from the battle lines. But when they saw how it worked, how it stopped a tank dead in its tracks, the military started to listen. And McAllister? Well, he simply stood in the background, hands in his pockets, watching the metal and steel that he had worked so tirelessly to fashion, taking on the enemy in ways he had never imagined. But it was never enough to just be effective. The real question was whether it could be mass-produced. Could it be scaled? Could something born out of the hands of a farmer be refined into a true weapon of war? The days that followed were a blur for McAllister. He found himself visiting factories in the city, meeting with military engineers, discussing modifications to his design. At times, the conversations felt alien to him. The language of ammunition, armor-piercing rounds, ballistic trajectories. But he listened. He learned. And through it all, he held on to the one thing that had led him here, the belief that his simple creation could make a difference. One day, a new version of the device was presented to him. This one far more polished, far more deadly. The crude materials had been replaced with stronger, lighter steel. The triggering mechanism, once a basic, makeshift contraption, had been refined into something more efficient. The military engineers had improved on his design, but they hadn't changed its soul. It was still, in essence, McAllister's idea, a farmer's idea. That winter, as the Germans pushed forward across the continent, McAllister's invention found its place on the battlefield, What had started as a desperate hope was now a weapon in the hands of soldiers fighting on the front lines. And though McAllister didn't see it, his invention began to do exactly what it was supposed to do. It slowed down the relentless march of the enemy. The first reports came back, filtered through the military chain of command, talking about its success. A tank disabled. Another one halted. A supply truck destroyed. The victories were small, but they mattered. The real battle was the one for survival, and the small victories were like cracks in the German juggernaut, giving the Allies the space they needed to regroup, to strike back. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were grateful. The civilians, those who lived in the shadow of war, who heard the distant rumble of tanks and saw the dark clouds of battle on the horizon, they began to hear stories of McAllister's device. There was a sense of pride in the air, a feeling that perhaps the war could be won not just by the generals and the tanks, but by the quiet men and women who found ways to help in their own way. McAllister had never intended for it to be this way. He had only ever wanted to help. But in helping, he had found himself part of something larger, something far beyond the quiet fields he had once worked alone. And as he sat in his cottage that winter, the fire crackling in the hearth, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had taken. From a simple farmer to a man whose invention had changed the course of a war. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside felt far away, McAllister would often look out across the fields, where the wind would stir the tall grasses, and wonder, if he had never stood in that barn, never taken those first uncertain steps, where would the world be now? And so, with that thought, soft, lingering in the air, he would drift to sleep, knowing that while he had never worn the uniform, never held a rifle, he had done his part. His creation, born out of necessity, had made a difference, and that was enough. Winter passed slowly that year, each day weighed down by the quiet grind of war that never seemed to pause. McAllister had returned to his farm, the fields of green and the old tractor at rest, but his heart was no longer at peace. He had done something, yes, he had contributed, even if in the most unlikely way possible. But there was always the lingering thought, the question that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was it enough? The war felt like a distant storm, and no matter how far you were from the front, you could still feel the wind. The people in the village spoke of it constantly. The latest air raid, the news from London, the whispered rumors of what might happen next. Each report from the front lines was another crack in the facade of safety. Everyone lived with the weight of it, trying to hold on to their small corner of the world, their homes, their families, and their sanity. But McAllister wasn't just a farmer anymore. The war had taken him somewhere he hadn't expected to go, and now, even when he sat on the porch, drinking his tea and listening to the wind rustling through the trees, he knew something bigger was at play. The military continued to adapt and refine his invention. What had started as a crude anti-tank device built out of tractor parts was now being reproduced on a larger scale, though it was still far from perfect. Each device needed to be assembled by hand, each modification made with care. But what it lacked in sophistication, it more than made up for in its simplicity. It was easy to deploy, easy to use, and, most importantly, it worked. And it was working in ways that no one had expected. McAllister's invention had found its place not just on the battlefield, but in the strategy rooms of the military as well. It had become part of the British Army's arsenal. The first reports had been modest, speaking of isolated victories. A few tanks disabled here, a few halted there. But as time went on, the device began to show real promise. The first major test came in the spring of 1943, when German tanks, heavily armored and relentless, advanced through the French countryside toward the Allied lines. The Allies had been preparing for the fight, but they knew the odds were stacked against them. The Wehrmacht was formidable, their tanks moving through the terrain with the kind of certainty that comes only from experience. But McAllister's device had a certain unexpected advantage. It wasn't about firepower or speed, it was about slowing the enemy down, forcing them to take a step back, and giving the Allies the space they needed to regroup, to strike. It was in one of these pivotal moments, as German tanks rolled down a narrow road lined with trees, that McAllister's creation proved itself. The tanks were advancing swiftly, unaware of what awaited them. As the first tank rumbled over the field, McAllister's device was triggered. The chains and metal rods caught in the tank's treads, forcing it to grind to a halt. The crew inside the tank, momentarily confused, tried to dislodge the obstruction. But it was too late. The second tank, following close behind, met the same fate. In a matter of moments, a small group of Allied soldiers who had been waiting for the right moment sprang into action. With the tanks temporarily disabled, they were able to launch a counterattack, one that shifted the momentum of the battle. The German advance faltered, and for the first time, the Allies were able to make a stand. It wasn't a turning point in the war. No, that would come much later. But in that moment, on that field, McAllister's device had made a difference. It had delayed the Germans, given the Allies the edge they needed to regroup, to strike. And that was enough. In the days that followed, McAllister received word from the military, official word this time, that his device was being adopted more widely. They wanted to make improvements, refine the design, and standardize it. The farm boy who had once tinkered in his barn had now become an unlikely figure in the war effort. His invention, once dismissed as a crude joke, was now a part of the larger strategy. It was a small victory, but for McAllister, it was everything. But even as the news came in, McAllister couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. The war was still raging. The bombers still flew overhead. The air still hummed with the sound of engines. The ground still shook beneath the weight of the tanks and artillery. His invention had made a dent, yes, but the war was far from over. And he, like everyone else, knew that the outcome was still uncertain. One quiet evening, as the sun began to set and the cold winter air started to bite, McAllister sat on the porch, watching the orange glow of the sky fade into dusk. He thought about the men on the front lines, about the soldiers who would never see their homes again, about the families who had lost so much. He thought about the heavy toll the war had taken on everyone, not just the soldiers, but the people who remained behind, those who kept the home fires burning, those who fought in ways that no one would ever know. In that moment, McAllister realized something. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't seen the horrors of battle, hadn't felt the weight of a gun in his hands, hadn't heard the cries of those who had fallen. But in his own way, he had fought. He had done something small, but something that mattered. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around him, and for a moment, the world felt still. McAllister closed his eyes, letting the cold air wash over him, and he breathed in deeply, the scent of the earth filling his lungs. It was a strange feeling, being at peace with the world, knowing that in some small way he had helped to make it a little bit better. And with that thought, as the darkness settled in and the stars began to pierce the sky, McAllister stood up, turning toward the barn where it had all started, the place where the idea had been born, where the war had entered his life in a way he never could have imagined. In the distance, he heard the faint hum of a plane, a reminder that the war, for all its small victories, was still raging on. But for now, for this moment, McAllister could rest. His invention had made a difference. The months that followed were a blur, each day a new chapter in a long and exhausting saga. The war, ever unpredictable, had taken so much from so many. McAllister's farm, once a symbol of peace, had become part of something larger, a web of small victories and hidden contributions. The noise of war had crept into his life in ways he could never have anticipated, but it also brought a strange sense of purpose. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the fields stretched out before him, he could still hear the sound of that first tank grinding to a halt, the hum of metal that had started it all. As his invention gained traction, it began to take on a life of its own, transforming from a simple contraption built from scrap metal to a part of a larger, more refined weapon used by Allied forces across Europe. McAllister had become an unlikely hero, his invention now an integral part of military strategy. Soldiers had started calling it the farmer's bane, a nod to the fact that it was a humble farm tool turned war machine. Despite the success, McAllister remained unchanged, just as quiet, just as reserved as before. He knew the importance of his creation, but it wasn't glory he sought. It was survival, for his people, for his country. But with this success came the unspoken pressure, the weight of knowing that the lives of men were now dependent on something he had cobbled together in his barn. In the months that followed, the military continued to adapt his device, making refinements, improving the design, testing it under live conditions. The invention was no longer just McAllister's. It had become part of the collective effort of thousands of men and women, working in factories, on battlefields, and in the quiet corners of the world, where ideas took root. By the summer of 1943, the Allies were preparing for what would become one of the largest and most significant operations of the war, the invasion of Sicily. The German forces, still powerful and dangerous, had held strong in Europe, but cracks were beginning to show. And McAllister's device, simple as it was, became a small yet potent part of the pushback. It was in Sicily that McAllister's creation would see a true test. This was no longer a skirmish, no longer a few isolated encounters. The stakes were higher, the risks greater, and the outcome uncertain. McAllister's invention had proven itself time and again against German tanks. But Sicily was different. The land was rugged, the terrain difficult. The Luftwaffe still commanded the skies, and the Wehrmacht was preparing for a defensive stand. The device, now more refined and tested, would need to prove itself again, but this time under more demanding conditions. As the troops prepared to land on the island, McAllister was far from the front lines, but the weight of his invention was not lost on him. The military had insisted he remain at home, far from the danger, knowing that his work was too important to be compromised. Yet as the day of the invasion drew closer, McAllister couldn't shake the feeling that he should be there, on the ground, witnessing the next chapter of his creation. But his place was in the background, watching the soldiers who would use his device, knowing that their lives, and the outcome of this operation, depended on his simple idea, born in the quiet corners of a barn. The first reports came in quickly, trickling back from the front lines. The device had worked again, just as it had in previous engagements. The first German tank was halted, caught in the metal trap McAllister had designed. The sound of the tank's engine stuttering to a halt was a signal. The enemy had been delayed. The soldiers had a moment to regroup, to fight back. In Sicily, just as in France and elsewhere, McAllister's creation had proven its worth. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what that meant. It wasn't just about winning battles or destroying tanks. It was about survival, about taking back what was theirs, about pushing the Germans back, not just in one skirmish, but in the larger, unyielding struggle that had taken hold of Europe. McAllister's simple invention, his tractor-based anti-tank device, had become a tool in that fight, an instrument that gave the Allies just a little more time, a little more space to maneuver. Yet even as his device helped win these small victories, the war continued. McAllister had never seen the battlefield, had never heard the sound of tanks rolling or bombs falling. He knew the war from a distance, through reports and letters, through the whispers of soldiers who came by his farm. But he understood the cost, the weight of it, in a way that many did not. His invention had saved lives, but it had not ended the war. And in his heart, he knew that the true victory would come only when the war itself ended. The summer of 1944 brought new challenges. The tide was turning in favor of the Allies, but the Germans were not finished. The landings in Normandy, the push across France, the fierce battles in Italy, each front was a reminder that the war was far from over. McAllister's device, now in widespread use, had proven itself once more. But even as it helped the Allies win small battles, McAllister felt the burden of what was happening. His invention had helped slow the enemy down, given the soldiers on the front lines the chance to regroup and fight. But it was never enough to win the war on its own. In the quiet of the fields, with the wind stirring through the tall grasses, McAllister thought about what was coming. The war was moving toward its final stages, but the cost would be high. So many lives had been lost. So much had been destroyed. And yet, he felt a sense of duty, a sense of purpose that came from knowing he had played a part in something greater than himself. His invention, simple though it was, had helped shape the outcome of this war, giving the Allies a fighting chance when it seemed as though all was lost. And as McAllister sat on his porch, looking out over the farm, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The war was still raging, but there was hope now. Real hope. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the land, and for the first time in years, McAllister felt the quiet peace of knowing that his work had made a difference, no matter how small, no matter how humble. The sound of the wind, the rustle of the trees, the faint hum of a plane overhead. It all reminded him that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could make extraordinary contributions. And as the stars began to pierce the sky, McAllister closed his eyes, a quiet pride filling his heart. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and he had played a part in that change. And that was enough. The war, though beginning to tilt in favor of the Allies, was still far from over. The relentless push of the Wehrmacht through Europe was met by the stubborn resolve of the Allied forces, each day a new chapter in the fight for survival. McAllister had never imagined that his small, makeshift invention would become a symbol of something much larger. But there it was, in the hands of soldiers on the battlefields, proving itself in the thick of it all, against the might of German armor. By late 1944, the landscape had changed. The Allies were advancing in the west, breaking through the German lines, but the Nazis were digging in, refusing to relent. The Battle of the Bulge was in full swing, a desperate final push by the German forces to reclaim lost ground. Every inch of land seemed to carry the weight of the war. McAllister could feel the shift in the air, even from his small farm, a world away from the front lines. Still, his device, the one that had begun as nothing more than an idea in the quiet of his barn, was now becoming a crucial tool for the soldiers on the ground. His invention had been tested, refined, and deployed in various theaters of war, North Africa, Italy, France, and now, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, it was finding its place in the cold, wintry battlefields of Belgium. The German tanks, hulking masses of metal, were still a terrifying force. But now, there was something the Allies had, a simple, unexpected device that could turn the tide, if only for a moment. McAllister had heard rumors that his device was now in use in some of the most pivotal battles of the war. It was a strange feeling, knowing that something you created, something born from the simplest of tools, could be the difference between life and death for so many. The year 1945 brought with it a sense of finality. The war was nearing its end, but not without a cost. The Allies had retaken much of Europe, but the struggle to push into Germany was intense. The tanks, the machine guns, the bombs, they all still rained down from above. McAllister, who had remained on his farm, had heard the news. The war was almost over. The Allies were closing in on Berlin, and the Germans were retreating, cornered, desperate. But even as victory loomed on the horizon, McAllister couldn't help but feel a quiet weight pressing on his chest. He had built a weapon of war, after all, and while it had saved countless lives, it had also been used to destroy. He had never wanted to be a part of the destruction, of the killing. He had only ever wanted to do what he could to protect his own. The people, the land he knew so well, the country he loved. One evening, as the war's final days began to unfold, McAllister sat in his workshop once more, staring at the very device that had changed his life. The barn had long since become a symbol of something more than a place of work. It was where his creation had been born, and now, in the quiet of the night, it felt like the end of something much larger than he had ever imagined. The fields outside were silent now, the winds carrying the last whispers of the battle that had raged across the continent. The farm, once filled with the hustle of daily chores, had become an empty place of reflection, a place for McAllister to come to terms with the weight of his own actions. In his heart, he knew that he had contributed to something that would change the course of history. But it had come at a cost. The years of destruction, the loss of life, the faces of the soldiers he had never met, but whose fates had been shaped by his invention. It was all too much to bear sometimes. As McAllister sat in his workshop, he thought about the soldiers who had used his device, about the families who had lost so much, about the many lives that had been changed forever by the war. He thought about the farmers, the mechanics, the workers, all of them, people like him, who had contributed to the war effort in ways that would never be fully recognized. But McAllister had never wanted recognition. He had never sought glory. He had simply wanted to help, to find a way, however small, to make a difference in a world that had been torn apart by violence and hatred. And in that quiet moment, as the stars began to twinkle faintly in the night sky, McAllister realized something that had eluded him all these years. What he had created, for all its simplicity, had done more than just slow the enemy's advance. It had given the soldiers a chance, a fighting chance, in the face of overwhelming odds. And in that, he had found his peace. The war was over now. The soldiers had come home, the battles were won, and the world was beginning to rebuild. But for McAllister, the end of the war didn't mean the end of the journey. It meant something else entirely. A chance to live, to rebuild, and to find redemption in the quiet of his farm, where he had started it all. The farm, the land, the tractor, these things would always be a part of him. They were the roots from which he had grown. And though the war had taken much, it had also given him something in return. A sense of purpose, a deep understanding of what it meant to fight, not just for victory, but for survival. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth that night, McAllister felt the weight of it all lift just a little. The years of hard work, the years of sacrifice, had led to this moment. He had done his part. And now, as the first light of morning began to break across the horizon, he could finally rest. The world had changed, and so had he. The man who had once been just a farmer was now a quiet hero in his own right. And that, somehow, was enough. And in that quiet, as the winds rustled through the trees, he allowed himself one last thought before drifting to sleep. One simple truth that he had always known, deep in his bones. Sometimes, the smallest things can make the greatest difference.